As South Africa marks Reconciliation Day, one of the questions being asked is how far has the country come as far as that goal that was set in the mid-90s is concerned? Joining us to answer that very question is Professor of Law and Director of the Centre for Social Justice at Stellenbosch University, Professor Thuli Madonsela, and Diversity expert and founder of Diversi-T, Teresa Oakley-Smith. My thanks to you both for being on the SABC this evening. Prof, if I may start with you, so fostering reconciliation and national unity was the main goal post the 1994 election, right? Has the meaning of the day changed over the last 3 decades?
Certainly, I would say that, well, firstly, greetings to you, Tevihile, and to Teresa, and thank you for this privilege. I think before 1994, the most important thing was to get everyone liberated from direct racism, from legalized racism, sexism, and all forms of bigotedness, which included legal barriers to access to opportunities, resources, and everything. And post-1994 reconciliation is about dealing with the legacy, which is psychological divisions, social divisions, cultural divisions. But we also have to deal with the structural inequalities in land, in employment, and everything in society as part of reconciling. But we're better together than we used to be.
But Terry, how do you begin to continue then, if, as Prof is saying, we're better together than we used to build on that momentum when there are still pockets of South African society that actually don't want any reflection on why this country actually needed a big reconciliation project to begin with, the history of apartheid?
Are you talking to me? Sorry, Tevihile.
Yes, Terry, okay. I was talking to you. I was asking you about how we begin to move forward and continue to improve the levels of reconciliation in this country when there are still pockets of society, when you look at the false claims, for instance, of an Afrikaner genocide, who don't want to acknowledge the reality of South Africa, both in its past and today.
You know, I think it's a very complex question, and sort of having been working on the area of reconciliation over the last 30 years, I feel in some ways disappointed that we really haven't achieved nearly as much as we would have liked. I think it also stems partly from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes, we certainly got truth, some very ugly truths for white South Africans to hear. But I think the amount of reconciliation that's happened is still fairly minimal. I think there's public integration. You know, for example, when there's sports days and rugby matches and cricket matches, and people then will come together. But privately, I think segregation remains very limited. I've forgotten the exact number, but the amount of racial social integration is very small. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you ask white South Africans, you know, how many times have you socialized? Have you had black or colored or Indian people over to your house for a braai or for dinner? It's really very marginal. And similarly, levels of trust between the races, I find, are still very limited. And what's happened with this idea of white genocide, I think, has really marred steps towards reconciliation.
And just on what you were saying, Terry, why is it, do you think, that on a person-to-person level, there hasn't been that level of racial integration, for want of a better phrase?
Well, because South Africans still live in this incredibly divided country. I mean, apartheid geography is still very much a feature of people's lives. If you speak to white people about, you know, how often have you been to visit people in a township, say, or have you been to a rural area? I mean, there just hasn't been that kind of level. Most white people that go to townships are tourists who've heard about them and want to experience for themselves. So while we have some degree of mixing in schools, in universities, and certainly in some businesses, when it comes to getting out of the day of work and getting out of school and getting out of university, while there is some maybe social mixing, it's very, very limited. And I think, that's a huge problem for us and something that we really have to work on. And I think, far more could have been done by our government from 1994 to actually work specifically on issues of reconciliation.
Professor Madonsela, is that lack of person-to-person integration ultimately down to the fact that racism still lives and breathes in South Africa, even though some of us might want to sweep it under the rug?
Absolutely. Thank you. You are right, Thembekile, and I do also agree with our colleague, Teresa, that we could have done more. I think to deal with that apartheid that's still in people's minds, we need to do more on social determinants of racism. So in the past, the racism architecture did not just depend on laws. Yes, there were laws for segregation, but the churches played an important part in telling stories that made people fear each other. My colleague here, who is the grandson of Verwoerd, has written a book. It's just titled Verwoerd. He just talks about how whites were made to fear Black people. So you're right. If you go to funerals and weddings, that's where you see the segregation, that we still live separately. So slightly different from my colleague, Teresa, I would say we need to do more from civil society side, because I think government focuses a lot on law, and then it has used also employment equity laws to make sure that in the workplace we're told about each other and we're forced to integrate. But until we integrate at community level and we stop fearing each other, until we address, as Teresa says, apartheid, spatial disparities, we're going to struggle with this reconciliation.
And on that point, Terry, just what the Prof was saying regarding, the sort of manufactured sometimes scenarios where people are forced to mix. The challenge is, because you work in the diversity space, you can't force people in their homes, at their social gatherings, to mix. So until that happens, am I right in saying that the reconciliation project will remain one that is largely cosmetic?
Yes, I think so, and it's really unfortunate. I think that the challenge is to take the idea of reconciliation out of the workshops, out of the universities, out of the workplaces, and into people's homes. And you're quite right, Thembi, one can't force that issue. But I think it would be so enjoyable. It would give people so much knowledge about each other if people were able to do that. And it's basically fear that keeps people divided. It's fear and a lack of trust. And of course, that's exacerbated by levels of crime in our country. People are not very willing to go into their local neighborhoods, never mind moving into townships or moving into rural areas. So I think, there's a lot that works against reconciliation. And even if one looks at the kind of days like today, where there are speeches and where our president will stand up and talk about the importance of reconciliation, one sees very few white faces, very few Indian faces, apart from the stalwarts from the various political parties. So I think that we've got a lot of work to do. And I think we have done work, obviously. For example, the work that Prof Madonsela is doing and has done has been very useful. But I think if all universities could do that kind of work, if we could really encourage schools to do more, we would then move towards more social integration, and it wouldn't just be a public thing. I mean, people don't really believe in us as one nation. We tend to view ourselves as Black South Africans, white South Africans, Indian South Africans, and not South Africans first. And I think that's a problem.
And very briefly then, Professor Madonsela, because we're out of time, when you look at the World Inequality Report, 10% in this country of the population holds about 86% of the country's wealth. Majority of those people would be white in a country that is a black majority country, right? The face of poverty and inequality remains black in South Africa. Can that be divorced from any conversation, any effort to improve the levels of reconciliation post-1994?
Certainly, inequality cannot be divorced from reconciliation, because division through the instruments of the state was not just about dividing us as blacks and whites. It was about disadvantaging black people and advantaging white people. And so reconciliation has to come with also redistribution of wealth, redistribution of opportunities at work, and redistribution of land. But we need to find better instruments that include the average person, because the average person is angry because they work hard. But there's an eye of the needle there that makes it impossible to rise even if you work hard.
Professor Thuli Madonsela, Teresa Oakley-Smith, my thanks to you both for speaking to us on this Reconciliation Day. Have a wonderful evening further.